All right, everyone, let's get started. I just up front, I think Representative Tarwater may actually be in a legislative session, so he may get here a little late, but we can get started. First, thanks everyone for once again for taking the time to get back together to work through this process. One thing to note up front is that we talked earlier about having kind of 5 meetings over the course of this process, at least planned meetings. We've split this meeting 3 into a 3A and 3B, just because as all the submissions came in and kind of we looked at the landscape that needed to be covered, it just looked like a lot of land to be taken. And so our thought, particularly if we wanted to bring in some expert voices, was to really hone in on a few areas each time. So that's the reason why this is meeting 3A. So before we get into it, though, I do want to be able to kind of give a little bit of context as well. We're about halfway into the process, which set up front is going to be a fairly fast-paced process. The good news, though, is that even being at the halfway point, we've gotten a whole lot of submissions. We'll kind of put all that into context in just a bit. And have kind of created some frameworks for thinking about how to categorize them and begin thinking about some programmatic areas to focus in on. Not that the submissions go away, we're just kind of categorizing them in certain areas for us to be able to talk about thematically. And we're at the point now where even as we're looking at bringing in experts and best practices, one of the key things that we're going to need to start doing, or you're going to need to start doing, since we're just the support team, we're here to provide process support and decision support as best we can, but start honing in on the areas that are going to have the greatest chance to drive kind of catalytically long-term impact for Kansas. If you've gone through the submissions, you've seen there are an awful lot of submissions, and I think Matt brought up last time that it's going to be important for this group to really step back and say which things are going to have kind of big long-term impact. And they may not even be perfectly represented in some cases across the submissions as well. And it sounded like, particularly in areas like the innovation ecosystem, entrepreneurial ecosystem, workforce development, housing, as well as water, begin to kind of think about what the big opportunities in those spaces might be. Not to say that that's the only areas that this group may focus on, but certainly some important ones. And that's kind of driven kind of where we are now. And you'll see that in the coming slides as we walk through this. Before I start walking through, though, my guess is Representative Tarwater's not on yet, but Tian, I think you are. If you want to kind of make any comments before we start marching through this, go ahead.
I'm good, ready to get started.
Awesome. So go to the next slide. So in terms of what we're going to try and accomplish today, I'm going to spend a little bit of time just kind of reminding everyone where we are in the process and setting a little bit of context. Then we're going to talk a little bit around kind of the approach to filtering submissions and thinking about programmatic areas to get us kind of thinking about, how are we flying at the right level? and even reflecting some of the discussions that happened last time around how to think about profiling some of the opportunities, and then really spend the bulk of the time diving into, once again, kind of half the landscape around thinking through the issues in those areas, as well as potential programmatic areas for us to focus in on. Once again, those would house categories of submissions that we could then move into kind of the next phase in meeting 4, thinking about doing some scoring and prioritization. Once again, this is a super broad landscape of stuff. Economic revitalization almost seems like it was the all else bucket. And so, being able to really hone in through the judgment of the panel over time on the key areas is going to be pretty important. And then we can talk about next steps. So go to the next slide, because I think the next slide, when you step back, does a pretty good job of, setting the context. So, we had gotten, over 700 submissions, I think 758. And those submissions, when you look at the funding requests, accounted for about $13 billion of requests. And if you look at that, economic revitalization itself accounted for about 8 billion of that. There were a couple big submissions that accounted for about half of that 8. But even just kind of stepping back, looking at it, that's against a total potential size of funds of $721 million available at the Spark Executive Committee level to be allocated across all of the submissions, or at least the programmatic areas that the submissions define. So, once again, that speaks to 2 things, the importance of being able to prioritize, and the panel doing that through this process, and then the Spark Executive Committee is going to do it as well when they see what's coming from each panel. And then also, as we go through identifying any opportunities to be able to kind of extend that funding, continue looking on anything we're doing for ways to leverage local agency funds, private funds, anything in order to make sure that we can extend this. And that also extends to, there may be some important things here, some big ideas that really just aren't a sweet spot for these funds, or they actually sit better with some other funds. In some cases, there are even some areas that are kind of double dipping between what's in an agency budget or approaching other sets of funds, and we need to kind of take that into account as well. But anyway, the big key here is that it's a pretty big universe in general of what the whole process is looking at, and efficiency and modernization is the biggest part of that. Not only in terms of the amount submitted, in terms of funding requested, but also if you just look at the number of submissions, I think it's between 400 and 500 in terms of the number of submissions. So efficiency and modernization accounts for a much broader landscape than almost all the other panels. And, partially as a result, has a lot more submissions. It has the majority of all of the submissions across all the panels. So, so if that didn't get everyone's mind into got to think about prioritizing, I'm sure as we get through this more, hopefully people will kind of get into that mindset. Go to the next slide, 6. So on the next slide, just talks about where we are in the process. Like I said, we're right in the middle of the process. Once again, the numbers at the bottom were just kind of guessing directional numbers at the start, but the whole thought was where we are in the process now is we're beginning to try and form programmatic areas to be able to focus on. What are the most important ones that can really drive Kansas in the future from an economic revitalization standpoint? Once again, the submissions would fall into those areas, but this is really going to be over this meeting and the next kind of a honing in exercise. And then even once we hone in, the advisory panel can then kind of prioritize within that and create the final set of recommendations. And like I said, this may not be kind of a new focus for the panel, because I did get a feeling in the last session, some of the panelists are stepping forward and saying, hey, we really need to step back and think about what are a few things that we can really do to kind of change the game here. Go to the next slide.
Hey, John,
Yeah, go
if
ahead.
I could ask a question on the prior slide.
Yep.
I'm assuming that the idea filtering process at the bottom is notional. It's not suggesting that we're going to get down to 7 to 10 recommended projects
Well,
necessarily.
well, it was notional. We put
Right.
that in place at the start. But what it could say is we're going to be focusing the effort at programmatic areas. And so there could be 7 to 10 programmatic areas that within each one of them have submissions. And so it's ways of kind of creating some themes around those. So yeah, it would probably encompass more submissions in terms, that's how when we define the programmatic areas, we're going to be able to figure out what the funding request is because we're going to know what's in it.
Okay. Thank you for clarifying.
Yep. And that even goes into kind of the next slides. So for how to think about it. So in terms of, just to be really clear, when we talked a little bit about it last time, we were kind of on that slide where we said the process we're going through. And, in the initial set of pre-reads and continuing to do that was identifying the needs and opportunities fundamentally for Kansas and economic revitalization. Then moving to the next one saying, so what are some of the focus areas against those needs? And then on the right hand of that slide was, okay, thinking about projects, which represented by the submissions. And the other thing to keep in mind, the submissions, we got some things that were projects, but really it meant to be idea submissions. We just got a range of stuff. So some things looked more like ideas, some things looked more like specific projects. We got a big range. But then in between, kind of moving from the right in terms of specific projects and moving from the left in terms of areas of focus, there's something that we defined as kind of programmatic areas. It's the broad things that you can do to focus in on driving the most important levers against the key opportunities and needs. And that's the area, and you'll see as kind of we get into it, what that means in terms of the level we'll be flying at for prioritization. But that's the level that we're going to work at. It took a little bit, for instance, when we just had the efficiency and modernization panel exercise, yes, we went through it to get people's heads wrapped around it. But once we got into the exercise, I think they understood it pretty well. And the other thing to keep in mind as we go through this is that final project approval can't really happen in the advisory panel process because I'll get to you in a second, Brett. Because in this process, looking at the programmatic areas, which will how submissions go up as a recommendation to the Spark Executive Committee. And then the Spark Executive Committee will have more than can be funded, and they'll need to make trade-offs. And then it's going to need to go to the State Finance Council, which has to approve the recommendation from the Spark Executive Committee. It's at that point that then you go into kind of the detailed implementation process. Once again, the submission still in each one of the areas, and procurement process, which has certain requirements from Treasury as well as state level requirements. So it's going to be kind of tagging areas of focus and identifying the submissions that fell into that area, and maybe some places, things to look at where we didn't even get a specific submission. But it's almost saying, here strategically are the things we need to focus on. Once again, the intent would be if a submission was in an area that makes it all the way through, that would be something that would be focused on for procurement. But just kind of so people kind of understand the sequence of the process here, just wanted to be explicit with that up front. So before I move to the next slide where we talk about a little bit more, Brett, you had a question.
Yeah, this was the exact area I had questions about just in the stuff you sent out in advance. And I guess focusing on that last bullet, specific project approval cannot happen in advisory panel context. Is there a distinction between approval and recommendation? Yeah, like for instance, are you saying that ultimately this group will not recommend or approve any particular submission, but we're only going to identify the programmatic areas that we think are most beneficial, and then the executive team will take it to the next step? And for instance, we won't say these 4 water projects look dynamite and that's what we're recommending. We would make a more generic recommendation than that? Could you just
Yeah.
clarify that for me?
I think in some cases you'll say, yeah, here's the programmatic area, and you'd say, here are the submissions that fall into that kind of inspire the programmatic area. And if they're ones that you think are really good, include them there as kind of starting points. So that would be in the programmatic recommendation. So it's a recommendation, right? Because you can't specifically approve that project. Then the Spark Executive Committee would look at it as well and potentially tweak it. And then when it went into procurement, it would start with those sets of projects to do more due diligence around and make sure that you go through the procurement guidelines. But there may be some cases, if it's a category of stuff, where you might say these are some specific projects, but they may not represent the full universe there as well.
So John, can I ask another question based on what Brett just said? Can we filter? I mean, is there a possibility that we can say, these 30 to 40 are short-term projects that, aren't long lasting? Can we at least filter, or is that not going to be discussed either?
Oh, I think as the programmatic areas get defined and you look at the specific projects that could fall into it, I think you can decide which submissions are the ones that make sense to be in that area. So you could filter and say, these are the types of things that we don't necessarily want to go after here, if they're short-term or point solutions. So there is the ability to be able to kind of define what you mean by the programmatic area, even down to the submissions that would be recommended up.
I mean, I get to where you're saying when you're trying to filter down to the 6 or 7, I assume, it'll be water, it will be housing, rural housing, we'll have silos in each one, but I still think that there are, as I look through this, 40 to 50 that we could probably easily eliminate like that, just because of their term nature, and it's just a one-time short-term shot, help
But
you.
I would just say exactly, just because a submission falls into kind of just categorically a programmatic area, as we define the programmatic areas, we're going to say, here are the specific submissions that actually, based on how we're defining, trying to solve that program or shape it, that would really fall in versus the ones that wouldn't, right? And so it's going to be up to the advisory panel to really decide on that.
Tim, my understanding and how I'm going about this is, let's say we decide you made the water one, that's a programmatic area we want to address. There's 40 of those. We like these 6. We can definitely, it wouldn't exclude the other 34 if the Spark Committee wants to go back and pull some of them up, but they're going to also take some of our recommendations, right? Like, hey, we've vetted this. You guys might want to deep dive these 6. That's how I'm going about that. Now, if that changes, keep in mind, there's no precedence here for us to build this off of. And so we kind of get to write the playbook a little bit to ourselves, as long as we are all in agreement of it. But yeah, we're not going to say, hey, we definitely approve project A, project B. Here are the 3 or 4 buckets or 7 buckets we want to work with in, and then here's the best of what we think those buckets are. It's how I'm approaching this.
Yeah, the key here, particularly with this area being so broad, is that if you start at the submission level, you're going to get lost in point solutions, as opposed to saying, what are the 5 big things we need to drive the needle on, and then going back and looking at which ones of the submissions fit in those areas probably. But like I said, having done a panel where we did this yesterday, it should hopefully make more sense by the time we go through this. But if it doesn't, let's revisit it.
I like what Tien just said. I think that's the same approach that I understood that our directive was on this. That there's work to be able to cull all of these projects down into manageable categories, but that it's not, our responsibility doesn't just end there, that we are at some level making more discrete recommendations for the 400 plus projects, kind of which ones we recommend go to that level for further consideration by the Spark Committee, And obviously they can do whatever they want to with the recommendation, but that it's the advisory panel's kind of job or responsibility for the benefit of the executive committee to have done some of that work and to put forward the best, what we think of are the best ideas.
Yeah.
And then they can adopt that, adapt to that, or reject it, whatever they want to do.
Well, in reality, if you had, say, 7 or 8 programmatic areas that you prioritize, you're going to need to put a dollar sign against them, right? And so the only way that you're going to be able to get to the dollar sign to build it up is thinking in terms of submissions and either saying, do these submissions cover the whole landscape? If not, are there other things that would be included or not? And so that's kind of where it comes in, as we're thinking about, you're thinking about defining those programmatic areas. Okay. Are you willing to trust me a little bit and kind of let us start going through it and see if it works or not? And then. Great.
Do it.
Awesome. On the next slide, I think this was largely what we just talked about in the We Are Here. So I think we can kind of go past that. But, part of it is that there is kind of even post Spark, there is a kind of just a detailed procurement process that the Spark Executive Committee still can have oversight over. But, there's something that happens after that in terms of just getting into the detailed programmatic design and implementation. Go to the next slide. So not going to try and go into this in detail, but just to the point of the pre-read, actually, we started taking some of the things that we heard last time around ways of being able to profile the submissions and started grouping some of the submissions as well, really as kind of a decision tool for the advisory panel to begin looking at the submissions, maybe in some kind of different ways and be able to sort, thinking about alternative funding, investment type. So once again, not going to try and go through that, but that's kind of what was covered in the pre-read. And then one key thing on the next slide, which I'll always keep going back to, is to the point of the Spark Executive Committee itself. These are the guiding principles the Spark Executive Committee put forward. So, in terms of, we haven't set kind of specific targets for each one of the advisory panels of recommendations to come up to the Spark Executive Committee, but the intent is not for it to add up exactly to $721 million, that they would get, larger requests from that in aggregate from the 4 panels, and that would allow them to start thinking about some trade-offs. The one saying that I've said a few times I heard was, every project looks good in isolation, but I'd like to know when I'm saying yes to something, what I'm saying no to. So that gives them a little bit of ability in an integrated sense to be able to start making some of those trade-offs. And there may be a whole bunch of things that they end up trading off and saying, it's really important, but it just doesn't fit here. And those areas aren't necessarily going to go away over time either, because there are going to be lots of opportunities over time to revisit and think about funding for a bunch of these areas. And like I said before, a lot of these submissions are kind of in process against a few funding streams at this point. So we should take that into account. But in terms of the guiding principles, pretty clearly, when the Spark Executive Committee sees what's coming up from the panels, it's going to be looking at, are we, to what extent are they prioritizing sustainable programs through one-time use of funds, right? Don't want to do things that are going to create ongoing obligations or budgetary cliff issues. Are we looking to find ways to maximize the use of these funds, which are more discretionary? So, combining with leveraging local and agency funds. So really thinking that through and how to stretch these dollars. And then the third one, I think, is going to be ultimately maybe the most important one of all time, and something that's really important for sure in this panel is fostering long-term systemic impact for Kansas. Just because driving the economy and making sure that there are high quality jobs, for the next 10 years and beyond is going to be, an absolute tentpole for Kansas going forward. Considering equitable opportunities and outcomes, enabling flexibility within those investment strategies because things may change, hence, a need to think about things sometimes a little more programmatically, and ensuring that results are measurable and tracked and transparent. So, and I think in terms of transparency, just this exercise and doing this, in the manner that we're doing it, hopefully is already kind of setting the stage for that level of transparency. And it's, to that end that, everyone in this panel was brought on board, not just for your individual expertise, but for your judgment. And so, definitely this for sure is, if your judgment hasn't been leveraged up until now in this process, definitely going to start getting leveraged now because, everyone's not only going to need to have their individual area of expertise hat on, but also their integrated thinking hat on. It's going to be super important. Go to the next slide. So here's what we had heard, and we can have a little bit of discussion about this, to make sure we heard this correctly. But we had heard some principles for even thinking about the filtering and grouping things last time. And what we heard was investments should address high needs with catalytically impactful ideas. So not short-term point solutions. So let's think big. Let's think about places where we can make an investment that's going to have an outsized impact over time. So the more you can think about things that are systemic, and I think, Matt was the one who really brought that piece up when he was thinking about the innovation and entrepreneurial ecosystem. What can we do that can be kind of game changing? Investments should be made in areas that have largely allowable programs and existing funding is insufficient. I'd say on the allowability side, the way we approached it, you probably saw that, is, there are a few things that are just always explicitly allowable, a few things that are like never allowable, and in the middle, it's a gray area. What we tried to do here, because that's going to be important for this panel, is to say, is there a pathway for allowability or not? And, the approach that we're looking to take here is that if there is a pathway for allowability and it's important enough and can be a big enough game changer, then, let's as a panel push for that area, because we can work on the back end to have a pathway for allowability around it. So that being said, it's, we can take allowability into consideration, but really kind of the quality of the idea and the impact that it can have, we don't want to leave anything on the playing field around that. And then investments should avoid establishing programs requiring ongoing funding. So once again, don't inadvertently create kind of long-term budget items, from a state standpoint. So with that being said, I guess a question here before we start diving into a few of the areas we're going to focus on is, do people think that kind of captured where the panel was last time? Because these are your principles, not ours. We're just supporting. And are there any additional ones that people would think of now that we're going to start diving into this exercise that we should have top of mind as we go through it?
John, it's Ryan. I'd just throw out there as I continue to review the 414, applications that we had. One thing that I want to, I guess personally, I would see more value in program deliverables rather than administrative overhead. And I think within some of the submissions, there's a large variance of is it a brand new project and we got to, set something up? Or is there an existing framework that can be utilized to implement these kind of one-time dollars to see that catalytic investment, if that makes sense?
So what would be an example of that, just so I'm clear?
Well, I don't know if I have the spreadsheet pulled up right now, but rather than creating the shiny new object because there's a need, we closed down the hospital, we lost nurses, et cetera. Is there already some sort of program that exists either through the federal or I guess in our case, state deliverables? There's I know housing, wastewater, there's some revolving loan programs at KDHE. There's the Kansas
Okay.
Housing Corporation, if we can utilize a structure that's already set up to deliver the dollars to our goal, that is something that I would like to see happen.
Got it. Okay. So so look at what else there is to leverage. Don't think about this in total isolation.
Yep.
Got it. Okay. Any other thoughts?
John, what about, one of the initial proposals was from the state regarding additional base funding.
Mhm.
Does that fall into any one of these areas, or is that separate? How is that gonna fall in?
Yeah, I mean, that's already in play right now, and there may be some overlap with some of the submissions going at each bucket, right? And we need to get better definition around that. So we were just talking about that today, because we don't want to kind of double dip on this.
And John, I assume, if somebody gets a base or a base grant, that's a filter. If there's some that are in different categories, like I've been told that efficiency, looking at all their dollars going towards state programs. And I assume that if there are submissions, at the state level that fall into that other category, that they get eliminated from this area.
Yeah, well, that's not necessarily true. They when you looked at efficiency and modernization from a dollar volume perspective, not from a submissions perspective, a dollar volume perspective, the state level ideas were the bulk. The issue that came up on the local pieces were, one, they may have more local funding opportunities. And two, picking kind of one town hall, right, as a point solution, and not thinking from an equity standpoint, do I need to think about where are all the needs around town halls? And I guess the last one was, could you impact more Kansans by looking at some of the state things?
And John, I totally get that. What I was just saying is that there are state programs that we were looking at in that category that are going to get funded, then let's take them out of ours, if that makes sense.
Sure.
Tim, I think my understanding, so for example, we know that on paper, there's $100 million in affordable housing that's with the state's budget, right? And so how much of that do we want to add in addition to, if we decide from the SPARK committee on our side, if that's a programmatic area that we want to support, knowing that the state's already allocated that out of that general fund, or if base has X hundred millions of dollars. So our recommendations are going up, and then the team, as part of their due diligence process, will see like, hey, we might be double dipping here. So nothing becomes finalized until they do that cross-reference and due diligence of these recommendations came up, but there's additional funding within the state or other programmatic areas already that's in line. And so we can now move some of these funds to support maybe some of the others that didn't make the initial cut.
Yeah, there's a lot of moving pieces right now. We're just going to.
Yeah, for example, we know there's a big water budget in the state.
Yeah.
And how much of that are we going to use versus additional funds that we're going to recommend out of? Does that answer your question, Tim?
Well, what I was trying to get at is if we can eliminate, and I sound like I'm trying to cut, but it's like if we can eliminate some of these, I think we can get more creative on the other end. Is what I'm trying to get at. And if there's duplication, then let's take the duplication out, and then that way we can focus on, those core areas that you're talking about, and then get really creative, or the ones that are really creative. Is what I was just trying to eliminate.
Keep that mindset, Tim. That's exactly what we need. And as we go through this area by area, I think we're going to need to apply that. But that's the exact mindset to have. So appreciate that. So if we go into, we have one expert that's coming up, and he actually has a hard stop at 3. So I want to make sure that I give him a chance to talk. If you go to the next slide, what we decided to do and carving off for this session was really focus on workforce and then innovation and entrepreneurship kind of at the ecosystem level. And so we have experts around each one of those. to begin to kind of spark some conversations and some thinking with the group. Go to the next slide, just kind of in the interest of time. So if you look at the types of things that fell under them, innovation and entrepreneurship, or things like entrepreneurial ecosystems, incubator spaces, local entrepreneurship support systems, bioinnovation programs to improve capital to startups and entrepreneurs. So generally, those are some of the things in the submissions. Workforce development and resources had other specific areas that they focused on. There were some things that ended up going that were very industry specific that we'll cover the next time, that may have been like more targeted at agriculture or advanced manufacturing. We'll get to those in the next time. But we really wanted to make sure that we had kind of a dedicated conversation and pull in someone to help think about the whole innovation and entrepreneurship ecosystem and the opportunities there. On the next slide, one of the reasons we're doing this is, even as we, in this area, we need to decide, okay, is this an area, once again, if we create kind of a programmatic template around it that defines, okay, what's in it, how would we think potentially about an ask here? How would we think about the potential based on what we crafted for impact, feasibility, equity? These become the building blocks that we can start scoring and prioritizing in the next stage. But we're just trying to capture here, okay, for an area that we think is important enough, and we can either, if we have the time, build some of those, top level descriptors during the session, or based on, feedback in the session afterwards, and have them ready for the next panel session with advisory panel member input. But the goal is to kind of get to those building blocks that the panel can then prioritize against and kind of have a more apples to apples conversation about at the time. So in terms of the experts for innovation and entrepreneurship, it's going to be Brian McClendon, who some of you might know from University of Kansas. And then when we get into workforce topics, it'll be Donna Ginther, so from the University of Kansas. So with that said, they're going to walk through their perspective in each one of those areas in terms of the needs, opportunities, and trade-offs, and begin to engage in the discussion around those areas and answer questions from the panel. So with that said, I'm going to hand it over to Brian.
Anna needs to enable sharing because I'm not able to share.
Got it.
Okay, got it. Yep.
Okay, it works great.
Okay. Can everybody see the slides? So my name is Brian McClendon. I am currently adjunct professor at KU, but I'm now back in the industry, actually leading a technology team with a company called Niantic Labs, and trying to build an office for them in Lawrence, but also running offices elsewhere around the country. I came back to Kansas and really wanted to focus on building technology in the state. And so my wife and I actually run Free State Forge, which is just effectively a website / our own private investment thing. And we built TechMap Kansas. So we tried to organize all of the technology companies we could find in Kansas and also Kansas City, Missouri, because that's important to consider. And we were able to find more than anybody else ever has. I will not claim this is exhaustive, but it's better than any other source I've been able to find. And so if you search for TechMap Kansas, you'll find it online. So I want to cover regional stats because I think this is important that everybody sort of get a picture of where companies are. And just for definition, I consider a technology startup to be a company that is small, started since the year 2000, either has or has not yet received venture funding, and has not yet been acquired, and is focused on building a technology product. So I don't consider consulting companies to be a tech startup because they won't ever grow at high velocity. On the other hand, technology companies employing tech is basically anybody employing engineering, computer science, Or if they're, say, a med tech company, then the doctors that are designing the technology actually count as technology employees, but doctors employed by a hospital would not. So then I total up the number of tech employees and also the number of overall local employees employed by these companies, and then look at the breakdown across these 3 regions. And I think it's an interesting way to think about this. You basically have all of Kansas except KC. Then you have KCK, which is all of the suburban pieces, Johnson County and Wyandotte, and maybe a little bit outside. And then KCMO, I reach out to the right, but not too far. And then Kansas is the rest. And what's interesting here is there's obviously a lot of innovation, a lot of things happening in Kansas City, Kansas. Olathe, Leawood, lots of amazing things happening there, big startups, which I'll talk about. KCMO obviously doing well also. It's a bigger population center, but also has a lot of startups. The rest of Kansas still has actually quite a few, but not as many. So the bottom line is we have 777 companies that I would consider to be technology employers, and that's good. That means there's a lot of opportunities for tech employees to come around. And there are 247 companies that I consider to be startups. So that's the top level. I'll show you this. I'm not going to go through it, but for example, here are the top employers in the region, both KCK and Kansas, sorted by technology employees in particular, not by total employees. And as you can see, it varies. Spirit there in Wichita, Cerner's main campus is in KCMO. They are shrinking a bit right now, which is a bit of a bummer. Nobody knows really about FMT and KCMO, and it's huge. So, plenty of employers, some surprising ones like the Federal Reserve has a lot of people working in tech, a lot of software there. So here's a map of all the regional tech employers. You can see there's a little bit in Dodge City, a little bit out, I guess, in Hayes, but most of it's on the east side, but a little bit in the southeast. The startups, though, are much more tightly clustered. They're basically Manhattan, Emporia, Wichita, and Lawrence and Kansas City. And there's a lot of them, but many of them are very small. So here are the top startups in Kansas, and C2FO is barely in Kansas. It's on State Line Road in Leawood, but it now has actually, I thought I updated this. It has 800 employees. They are now a $1 billion unicorn. This founded by Sandy Kemper, and they're doing amazing things. They have about 230 tech employees. So this slide is out of date. Apologies for that. But you can see some of the other companies, including Bardavon, which I guess Matt is on this call. So he's in the top regional startups with his work. You can also see that several of them have been acquired in one form or another. But Civic Plus in Manhattan has quite a few people. Payit was acquired. FishTech was acquired by bigger companies, but they still employ those people, and you can consider those mostly a win. Just looking at Kansas specifically, you can see that Sprint then becomes the big Goliath, and then Garmin, Black & Veatch, Spirit's still there, Cerner's Kansas campus, and so on down the line, including FMT, Honeywell, employing quite a few people in Olathe, which most people don't realize. And the tech startups in Kansas specifically, again, I'll just go through this, take a peek. You can check the slides later. And then I threw this one in because I know there's some Wichita folks on the call. Wichita has actually a lot of good small startups, but not any real big ones. Greenfield Robotics is actually technically outside Wichita, but is close enough to count. There's some payments expertise in Wichita and some other smaller companies, but you can see, I'll call out one here because it goes to what was being talked about a bit earlier. Groover Labs is not actually a startup. Groover Labs is actually an incubator, and it was founded by a couple whose last name is not Groover, but is related to Groover. I'm sorry, I don't remember the names, but they're awesome. And the space they've built is awesome for hosting startups in their sort of incubation phase. And so if I had to recommend a place to put money, that would be a one-time spend that I think would really help the ecosystem in Wichita. So here's what I suggest. And this first slide is actually closer to what Donna's going to talk about. It's more about employment. But in the state of Kansas, we spent money on the University Engineering Initiative Act in 2012. We actually increased the number of engineers produced in Kansas by several hundred per year. I think 550 is where we ended up. And that was great. It was so great that the legislature actually re-upped on a secondary school investment and continued that in 2022 or 2021. They voted on it. And now in 2022, it's in force. But I think we need computer science, because computer science is even more powerful and valuable than engineering. And we are deeply short of software engineers. All these startups are actually limited in a lot of cases by their ability to hire and by their ability to hire Kansas-based programmers. Some other minor comments. Lawrence actually has limited office space, which is surprising. There are not enough good community forums in Kansas City for folks to meet each other and get together. And this last item we actually succeeded in doing at the end of mid to late last year. The legislature agreed to allow computer science to be an elective credit for Kansas high schools. Now, this is, I think, most relevant to the committee. These are things I think we could do to help the ecosystem. And there are plenty of sort of programs that we could put money into that would amplify what's already there. So I'm not going to, I run KU Startup School. It's a free class that I teach at KU. I don't need money. Don't give me money. Casey's Pipeline is another very small startup supporter. Techstars has actually kind of transformed itself a couple of times. I'm not sure they're the right place. There's a thing called the KC Collective, which is a meetup for technology companies, small companies. And then there's Wichita Startup Week, which is actually a very well organized and not well funded, but well organized meetup to get startups to talk to each other. And I think it's one of the strongest things we have in the state. We struggle in Kansas with seed investment. Getting venture capital from the coasts is an adventure at best. And we need that early money that gets us to the point where we're big enough to go ask for the venture capital money, for those Series A, Series B rounds. And so Digital Sandbox in Kansas City and the Fountain Innovation Fund in Kansas City are two examples of this. We need more of that. And so support, some of those are, I think they're nonprofits. I think Fountain Innovation Fund is explicitly a nonprofit. So there's certainly an opportunity to put more money in, which would circulate more money in the community. We also need to educate the Midwest investors, the family offices and the other folks who could invest money about what it means to make a high risk, high reward investment. And in particular, if you want a high growth technology startup, something that does the hockey stick of, Instagram or Google or Keyhole, a company I started, you need to put money in and you need to be willing to take a risk that the whole thing's going to go to zero. And that's okay. One of the things I say, and I'll repeat it to this committee, is that the net new job growth of all current companies in any locale, whether it's in a city, a state, or whatever, the net new job growth is zero for all current companies. The only net new job growth happens if you have startups, because big companies, they grow, they die, and it all washes out. The only way to actually increase employment is to have startups, because if you don't have them, your existing companies are going to be zero. They're flat at best. And that's non-intuitive, but it's important to understand. You must have a good startup ecosystem. And this is, I focus on technology startups, but throughout the state, throughout all levels of employment, we need new hair salons, we need new, roofing companies, we need new everything to continue to cycle through, because other companies are going to die. And if you don't have that new entrepreneurial spirit, your employment is going to go down. Anyway, off my high horse. Kansas Angel Investor Tax Credits are very, very useful. They motivate me to invest money in Kansas companies. The challenge is that it's actually currently architected in a slightly biased way against Kansas investors. If you're a Missouri investor using Kansas Angel Tax Credits, you can sell your tax credits to somebody, but if you're a Kansas investor, you cannot. And that would be a nice tactical thing to fix. Another thing would be to increase the angel investor tax credits. We have not run out It's $6 million a year, I believe, but I think with better marketing and better understanding, we could do a lot more with this and get a lot more startups funded and a lot more growth that hopefully leads to those jobs in the future. This next one is entirely legalistic and not related to this committee. And the last one is, I'm not quite sure how this committee can help, but university faculty needs to create more startups. They need to feel like they can build a company from their research, that there's support in the community, and that they can go do it. There are some entrepreneurial professors at KU, but not very many and not enough of them. And there's a few at Kansas State and Wichita State that I've met, but again, not as much. So the last item I'll mention in my talk is I visited Wichita, got to see Groover Labs. I was extremely impressed. I also got to visit NIAR, National Institute for Aerospace Research, I believe. And they are shockingly good at what they do. They don't just do aerospace, they do robotics, and they have all sorts of cool projects, that are all hung off the Wichita State engineering and aerospace group. And they are doing some really cool things. And I think that they are there is somewhere there that could be amplified, if I was going to put money in. And as a Lawrence person, it goes against my own, biases, but I really liked what I saw there. BTBC in Lawrence is not the same thing, but it's another place that you could put money. It's effectively a housing and a little bit of an incubator for startups that is attached to KU. So those are my comments and thoughts. This is the executive summary, and you can find this deck just by searching for TechMep and Kansas. And I'm happy to answer any questions. And I shouldn't have shared my also.
Any questions while we have Brian?
Brian, have you connected with Josh Oding with Nexus in Wichita?
I don't think so. I've talked to a lot of people, which I may have forgotten, but that doesn't sound familiar.
Yeah, he's leading a pretty impressive group on just getting a lot of visibility for tech startups. I mean, he hosts a monthly panel where there's committed family offices, private equity people, individual entrepreneurs that are looking to get into investment in the tech space. And so they bring people together and make sure they're vetted, right? And they get to a certain stage where they can present to this panel to get potential funding. So if you want, please get my email address from the team, and then happy to connect the two of you guys. But you're missing a big piece of tech if you're not talking with Josh in the greater Wichita area.
I think I've presented at his monthly thing once, but
okay.
I remembered based on what it was named, not him by name. So, but I will happily reconnect with him again.
Perfect.
Yeah, Kurt Gridley and Tracy Hoover is Groover. Thank you.
So Brian, what do you think about, what is your net view on the kind of innovation and entrepreneurial ecosystem in Kansas when you look at it versus other states?
Well, I spent 30 years in Silicon Valley, so that's a very unfair comparison, but I've also looked at Boulder and Austin, Huntsville, St. Louis, and many of these cities are doing better than we are. And some of it is that they have a large number of tech employers. And one of the ways that startups happen is these big companies shrink or do something that provokes the smart people to go do a startup, whatever it is. Like they make a strategic mistake, they lay off some people, whatever it is. That's how many companies are created. And so Boulder had a huge storage disk hard drive industry. And over the years, it threw off a bunch of former employees that did the kernel of what became the Boulder ecosystem, which is pretty famous, as much more equivalent to Lawrence than Silicon Valley or even Austin. Austin had IBM and Intel and all sorts of stuff. So I feel bad that Boulder, has like a 20-year lead on us, but I would rather follow Boulder down that 20-year path than stay where we are.
Yeah, I agree with that, Brian. Like one thing we're missing, and we see this in a lot of entrepreneurship ecosystems, not just tech, but company ABC starts, they have a major liquidity event, the C-suite all makes a lot of money because they got bought out, and now the C-suite goes out and launches all of their own companies, right? Because they have the funding to do so, and then they bring in additional funding with that. We just haven't seen that happen in a large scale from the tech space yet. Like I said, we are relatively new to that, but yeah, we haven't had those major liquidity events in our state.
That is exactly right. That is one of the biggest shortcomings, and I'm really hoping, you know, in 2-3 years that C2FO produces that for a chunk of people. So a tactical example is like iVerify was a company in Kansas City that was several years old. It was bought actually by Alibaba, which is a bit weird, but they were sold for $150 to $200 million. And after the 2-year lockup, the execs and smart people from that company left and started to form other companies. And in particular, a company called Triple Blind is now, in my mind, headed towards being another billion-dollar unicorn. And it was founded by one of the former employees of iVerify and funded actually by the CEO of iVerify, or, you know, partially funded. And that company is very exciting. That, you know, but it's younger. It hasn't been around or is anywhere near as big as C2FO.
If you're in a state where the funding isn't mature, how do you prevent kind of when someone gets funding them getting pulled to a coast and rather than building the business in the state?
You try to have enough good employees that they can build their company here, because that's the reason to pull to the coast is because, you know, people believe, oh, in New York or in San Francisco, but honestly, that belief is changing. I mean, we have a different thing, and I think Donna's probably going to talk about, you know, work and remote work, and nobody fully understands the true impact of COVID and Zoom upon the future of companies. Like, I now have a full-time job at a company in California, and they're letting me manage 100 people, and I have not yet even traveled since taking the job. So I will next week actually go to California for the first time. So I think that's going to change how many people think about things, which can be both good and bad. It means that, you know, we can find employees from anywhere, but it also means that anywhere can find employees from Kansas. And that is not good for our entrepreneurial system, but it's good for state employment. And anyway, I don't want to steal any of Donna's thunder, so I'll probably stop here.
I guess, and I know you kind of turn into a pumpkin at 3, but maybe this would be a way to kind of leverage the remaining time is, as people think about this, they've looked at the submissions, they think about, you know, entrepreneurial ecosystem, you know, and innovation system programs and just the space in general. Where are people coming out in the panel in terms of their thoughts around how important an area this is and how to crack it? Because it'd be interesting getting people's thoughts, and then, you know, Brian hearing the thoughts and being able to maybe provide any insights.
Hey, well, this is not my space, John. But I mean, I guess we've heard about you know, this type of need for a long time. You know, well before Spark was ever established, and I guess I would hope that we'd be able to find some projects that are able to allow multiple good ideas to tap into those resources and let sort of the best ideas go forward, not necessarily us kind of picking a winner and loser from some discrete projects, but allowing for some ground to be laid, a platform that we can give a boost, you know, a boost to this ecosystem that, if you can even call it that, since it's so small in some respects, but I would love to be able to see us help. And I just can't articulate, you know, what it is that we specifically need to do, but I think we absolutely have to invest here.
Great. Anyone else? Representative
I'll add to. Oh, go ahead.
Go ahead, Andrew.
No, I was just going to echo, I think, Sam, I know that's not your expertise and I don't know that it's mine or others on the panel. So Brian, thank you for your comments. There's so many different things that I think Kansas's entrepreneurial ecosystem could do. I know we've done similar analysis. I saw Donna's study in the chat, kind of catching up. I mean, there's things we need to do from the communication and kind of telling hero stories of the wins in the companies. Brian, I think your map does that to some degree. I know nothing's ever perfect and there's always missed companies and missed opportunities there, but I think we collectively need to tell the stories better. I think we need to help connect entrepreneurs to resources at the right time. You know, sometimes helping that entrepreneur see that venture maybe not is all that they hoped it would be, or that their eyes were a little bigger. Sometimes failing fast is a little bit better than kind of pushing that long shot dream forward. And then I think early stage funding is something that we've seen in Wichita that is often lacking. We're woefully behind in SBIR and SBTTR grants from the federal level as a state. So early stage funding in a number of fronts. I'm still getting my head around, John, of how Spark resources might be deployed and what would be the appropriate path for that. But I think this was a useful context of the conversation.
Yeah. And the one thing I appreciate that, Andrew, you know, Representative Tarwater, I think you're on now, and you may have come into this partway through. Just kind of curious as to whether you have any thoughts, because you'd mentioned the last time how important kind of enabling entrepreneurship in Kansas is.
Yes, we talk about it quite frequently in the Commerce Committee. We haven't really gotten anywhere with it, but Brian did touch on some of the issues. Brian, are you familiar with the KU Innovation Park? And they have a request in this subcommittee. You mentioned that we need more university research startup businesses, and that's right, exactly what they're doing there. I've toured that facility, and I think they have a pretty good business plan in place for that.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's a good example, and it's more psychology of the professors that we really need to work on. Like we need to reach out to them and sort of bring them out of their risk aversion academia and into, you know, you've got a great idea here and we'll help you run with it. Because a lot of them don't want to be CEOs. They don't really want to leave academia, but they can spend enough time to start the company, hand it to it. And what we need are CEOs, what we need are leaders to then take the ball and run with it.
There's a big difference between a researcher or a whatever, can't think of the word, teacher, professor, and a businessman. They're not one and the same, that's for sure. But yes, so we have heard many presentations as far as the company's dying and we need to restart new businesses. And that's kind of how Garmin came out, you know, out of somebody's garage, and Cerner is the same way in Kansas City. And we do spend a lot of money on incentive packages, bringing large companies to Kansas. But we got to be mindful, I think, to water our own roots so that we can have our own startup businesses that come from here and don't really cost the taxpayers anything to start.
Yeah, and I think one of the things that would help both draw companies to Kansas and help our own ecosystem is to have more people in the tech STEM education plan. We are short of the whole nation is short of computer scientists, but Kansas is slightly shorter at a minimum, and we have an opportunity to go out ahead. And if we have more computer scientists, we will A, build more companies, and B, we can attract companies to our computer scientists. And there's a set of folks who don't actually want to leave Kansas, and the only reason they ever do is because the coasts draw them out there. And I'm thinking we could try to change that.
And I'm sorry that I was late I chair Commerce Committee, and I thought I would be out of there in a half hour. And anytime I think that's going to happen, all hell breaks loose. So my apologies for being tardy.
No problem.
No problem. Before we lose Brian, anyone have any questions or thoughts or comments? Well, thanks, Brian. I really appreciate you taking the time. I know you were kind of pretty time constrained, but this was excellent. Really appreciate it.
Good to talk.
So before we go into Donna's piece, I would suggest one of the things that we'd gotten in the exit surveys before was, can we take a little bit of a break in the middle of these sessions? So my suggestion is let's take a break for like the next 4 minutes or so, give people a chance to kind of refresh a little bit, and then we'll come back and dive into the next discussion around workforce. All right, let's get ready to come back in maybe about a minute. All right, well, let's get started again. Before we kind of hand things over to Donna to talk about workforce, just curious. Well, one observation is I think to the point someone had made earlier, this is kind of points to the importance of like really honing in on a few areas where we really want to be able to try and focus in and kind of flesh out what we could think about programmatically in those areas, because there are submissions that fall squarely in what we were just talking about with the innovation campus investment being one. But the more we're able to like kind of really focus in and craft that programmatic area, and we'll work with some of the discussions we had here as well as work offline before the next session, the better off we're going to be, because there may be some kind of key leverage points in that ecosystem that are really important beyond even just the submissions that we've been seeing. And so being able to kind of put some focused thought into that and some research is going to be pretty important. Before, so once again, before we go, is there anything that like around that topic that you think we haven't necessarily covered at this point to talk about? Once again, Representative Tarwater, I know you'd mentioned the past around enabling entrepreneurs. Was that previous discussion, did that kind of cover the landscape you were thinking about, or was something missing from that?
Yeah, well, so I missed a good chunk of it. I was only on for a few minutes when he wrapped it up, but that looked in line with what I was thinking.
Okay, great. Awesome. Well, with that being said, let me hand it over to Donna for her presentation on workforce. And once again, thank you, Donna, for taking the time to meet with the panel.
Well, thank you, John. I'm going to share my screen. Can everybody see the slides? Can you see the slides? Great. All right. Thank you for having me. I'm going to talk a little bit about the labor market, but before I do that, I picked out like a figure from our report on entrepreneurship in the state of Kansas. Prior to 2012, Kansas had a lot of policies to support entrepreneurship, and those were unwound. And you can see what happened to growth and entrepreneurship in the state after 2012. The US and our surrounding states increased their entrepreneurial activity according to this index, but Kansas really dropped. And our report recommends that you think about early stage investment funding. We also recommended matching funds for the SBIR and STTR grants. And there was a large demand for startups and CEO talent. I second everything that Brian had to say. Kansas needs to grow its own companies. So now I'm going to turn to the topic I was asked to speak about, which is the labor market in Kansas. We have challenges in this state with respect to lower wages, population growth, childcare, and broadband. And I'm going to talk a little bit about workforce investment priorities. The COVID recession was unprecedented in our lifetime. We lost over 22 million jobs. And as of January, we're just down a little under 3 million jobs. Our unemployment went to the highest in my lifetime. In the US, it was 14%. In Kansas, it was 12.5%. Kansas unemployment as of December is 2.2%. We have went from having an unemployment problem in 2020 and 2021 to now having a labor shortage. And so why do we have a labor shortage? First of all, they're calling it the Great Retirement. More than 2 million people have left the labor force and they're not going to return. The baby boom was holding on to their jobs for a long time. They didn't do a very good job of saving for retirement. So you had a lot of older workers in the labor force. And we had a huge run up in the stock market, and they looked at their portfolios and they all jumped out of the labor market at the same time. So 2 million people retired. Another issue creating a labor shortage is childcare. Mothers were hit hard and they left the labor force. Childcare centers have closed and have not reopened, and they cannot find workers because of low pay. Even if people wanted to work, and if they have small children, it may be difficult for them to do so. And this was true during the pandemic, probably less true now. Some people decided that some jobs aren't worth dying for. And so you saw a slow return to the labor force in 2021. So we looked at Kansas data, and a lot of what we see in terms of our labor shortage in Kansas is retirement. 35,000 Kansans have retired in the last year. So that's the orange bar. So you see this big jump up between 2020 and 2021. The blue bar is disabled. That hasn't changed. School hasn't changed. Caretaking hasn't changed. There was no evidence, at least through the first quarter of 2021, that enhanced unemployment benefits were keeping people out of the labor force. If we look at the retirement to population ratio in the state of Kansas, it's now at the highest it's been since we started tracking the data in 2012. Retirement started to increase between 2017 and 2018, but they really accelerated in 2021. I like to say that the baby boom has all left the building at one time. Job postings, I mean, postings are really noisy and they give you a sense of the demand, but it's not, they're too noisy, to be totally useful. It's just an indicator. But compared to January of 2020, job postings in Kansas are up 107%. In the US, they're up 39%. So we have high demand for workers, and we don't seem to have a lot of supply with a 2.2% unemployment rate. And all of this adds up to employees quitting in droves. These are national data, but you see these are the quit rates. Quits fall during recessions, they fell during COVID, and then all of a sudden coming out of COVID in 2021, you see quit rates going up monotonically. So workers are seeking better hours and better compensation. Coupled with the problem of being at full employment, Kansas has a population problem. This is from 2018, and I think this bears further study. Anything that is of a red color is out migration. So you see 1% of the population dropped, left Shawnee County and left the state, 1.2% in Wyandotte. This is Fort Riley, where you expect a lot of turnover, but 2.2% of the population left in Sedgwick County. So if Kansas is going to grow its economy, it needs to retrain and attract prime age workers. Layered on top of the population issues are, again, childcare. This is a picture of childcare deserts. This is where you have 50 or more children in a census tract with no childcare. That's anything that's yellow, or 3 times the number of children as there are providers. And you see, even in our most populous counties, such as Johnson and Douglas and Sedgwick, you have childcare deserts. Now, the Health and Education Spark Committee is going to address this challenge, but this challenge needs to be met if you're going to increase the state's workforce. On top of that, if you're going to educate new workers, we need broadband. If you're going to attract workers who are going to be remote workers, you need broadband. If you're going to have hybrid work situations, you need broadband. So the state now defines broadband as 100 plus for average download speeds. So those are the 2 dark green colors. Even if you're generous and say 51 is acceptable, you notice everything that's orange, red, or yellow is inadequate broadband. And we looked at the populations in these census tracts. Over 1 million people in the state of Kansas have inadequate broadband. That's a lower bound estimate. Now, the Connectivity Spark Committee is addressing this challenge, but if you're going to develop your workforce, you need this kind of infrastructure, as with childcare. So Kansas needs skilled workers. It has lower national and regional workforce development rankings. If you look at the Kansas Framework for Growth, they document this. We need to upskill and reskill. Skill gaps will grow as the impacts of automation and the knowledge economy make skilled work even more valuable. So there's going to be a high demand for skilled jobs. We need technical education centers to help get people into these high demand fields. And there's a lack of workforce experience among younger people, which poses a major challenge. We need career opportunities and navigation and resources for younger people so that they can match to these new jobs. One of the most distressing things coming out of the COVID recession, usually during a recession, people lose their jobs. They go back to community college and technical college, get better skills, and are better prepared for the jobs coming out of the recession. That didn't happen in COVID. And in fact, community college and technical college enrollments have dropped precipitously in the state. So we are having lower supply of skills coming out of COVID than we did prior to COVID. We need workforce support for disadvantaged populations. I was listening to a testimony before the Legislative Post-Audit Committee. We're also doing some research looking at the baccalaureate population in the state. 24% of students matriculating at Kansas four-year institutions need remedial coursework, and most of that coursework is in remedial math. If you're going to have a skilled technical workforce, they need basic math skills. Also, we should consider expanding programs like the Wichita Promise program to other technical and community colleges for high demand occupations. This, if people go through these training programs, this reimburses the cost of getting that additional training for those high demand occupations. Kansas has several workforce programs, such as Workforce Aligned with Industry Demand. Kansas Works on the Job Training Program, the Registered Apprenticeship Program, the Senior Community Service and Employment Program, the Kansas Works Mobile Workforce Center, Ticket to Work, and Older Kansans Employment Program. These programs exist, but our need in the state is great. So to summarize, we need access to reliable broadband for education and work. We need access to affordable and high quality childcare so that parents can go to work without worrying about their children's welfare. In order to evaluate the efficacy of how you decide to spend these funds, I think we need a study of the skills gaps in Kansas to target these investments. Training opportunities are needed to provide skilled workers, and financial support and incentives to invest in these skills are needed for the workers in the state. I am happy to take any questions that you might have.
This is John. Donna, one quick question, and then I'm sure everyone else has a lot of questions, is when you look at the migration rate out of Kansas universities versus other states, is there more of an outflow just even out of the college level in Kansas versus other states?
I can talk about Kansas. I can't talk about other states because I don't have other states' data.
Got it.
So you could look at the flow of people, say 22 to 26, right? So that might capture the flow, college educated workers. So you could maybe approximate that. One of the things that's come out of the work that we did for the Governor's Tax Reform Council is that there's a need to understand why Kansas population grew more slowly than all of our surrounding states. We had a very I had a lot of upheaval in the decade between 2010 and 2020. So trying to understand what drove people out of the state, why we lost a lot of people or didn't grow as fast, I think is critically important as we think about policy moving forward.
Right.
This is Brett Leopold. When we look at this area, and you mentioned the need for reskilling or upskilling, but if you've only got 2.2% of the population that's unemployed, who are you targeting to bring into these programs? And I look at some of the submissions that we have for great training programs to improve people's skills and prepare them for the workforce. But I just wonder, as you said, with the population outflow, a lot of the people in the state have jobs. How do we connect those dots?
Well, I'm gonna pull something up here and show you. I'm going to just share another slide. I'm going to share a slide from another deck because that's a really good question and I have the answer for you. All right. Slideshow from current slide, and I'm going to share this now. We're a low-wage state. So if Kansas were to increase, so say you give people better skills, that increases the demand for those workers, and you pay them $12 to $15 an hour for those high skills. This is the share of workers in various parts of the state that would receive a pay increase if you paid a $12 minimum, if you had a $12 minimum wage. Elk County, a third of your workers. Pawnee County, a third of your workers. Reno County, which is adjacent to Sedgwick, a fifth of your workers, all in Southeast Canada. So you have people who could potentially be reskilled and upskilled throughout the state. You know, they're not in the top 5, right? They're not in Johnson. They're not in Shawnee. They're not in Sedgwick, right? They're not in their population centers. But you go adjacent to those population centers, and that's, you can attract, you know, you can create a better skilled workforce.
Mm-hmm. Brett, on that question, one of the ways I was kind of squaring it too a little bit with what Brian was talking about was, I think when he was differentiating of like, what are the skills of people who are future job creators? You know, someone who's going to start up a company. And so he was kind of looking at those skills, I thought. So it may be that kind of all skill sets aren't the same too, but that was just my impression. Any other questions or thoughts?
Hey, Donna, I'm the Aggie, I guess, on the panel here. So I guess question I have, we see a lot of first generation immigrants, whatever it may be, working in some of those more rural agrarian type communities. Their children go off to college, become educated, oftentimes don't come back to Elk County or Norton County. What goals or what can you kind of tell us, not only from the reskilling, but also to try to maintain some of those rural communities that are low paying jobs, that are low skilled jobs? Those are still jobs that we have to have. So, I mean, do you have any information from KU on how we can continue to backfill and not necessarily rob Peter to pay Paul and move him to an upskill job?
Well, quite frankly, if the federal government had immigration reform, that would help our rural communities quite a bit. In the absence of that, workers respond to pay. If you're trying to attract and retain workers, you come up with ways to pay them more. So that's another issue. I mean, family, one of the arguments I've made about economic development is that, we need to create an ecosystem in the state that supports families. We have a lot of the pieces. We have a really good education system. We have great higher education. We have a low cost of living, even in our most expensive parts of the state. So those are all positive. So what policies and procedures can we make it so that people can come here, raise their families, and remain here and be successful? You think about, I'm also doing a project sort of looking at sort of like what, communities suffer when their hospitals close, right? So what can we do to support our rural hospitals, right? Because a rural hospital is a big employer. They're an anchor in a community. Well, then you think about Medicaid expansion, right? I mean, so holistically, there are a whole bunch of policies that will affect how you can support a rural community. You need your school, you need your grocery store, you need a pharmacy, you need a dentist, right? So we have a program at KU called the Red Tire Program, where we match people who are retiring, the veterinary practice or the dental practice or the pharmacy. We match those people with new owners, and we've been successful at matching 90 companies with new owners, for example. So those types of policies can help with rural Kansas. I mean, rural Kansas is, if you think about how technology affects jobs, agriculture is the first place where you see how technology can eliminate jobs, right? I mean, John Deere is now offering a driverless tractor. Technology is going to take away even more jobs in ag moving forward. So it's a really hard problem, and I don't have a lot of good answers for you there.
Any other questions for Donna?
John, if
I made it. Go ahead.
Chairman, go ahead.
I made a few notes on the on childcare. Is it there's just not slots available, or is it too expensive?
So
Or both?
there are so Kansas in the past year has lost 350 licensed childcare providers. And so there aren't the slots.
Is that because we closed them or closed the state and people watched their own kids and these companies went out of business?
I was actually on CBS News. There was a report on CBS News last night. I had a brief cameo, but it was talking to a childcare provider in Topeka who couldn't find qualified workers. And so she's closing her childcare center.
So employment is an issue with everyone, and
those costs of attracting an employee to the childcare is passed on to the family. So we estimate that a third of the median woman's salary in the state would go to pay for infant care. And I talked to the child care provider, the center that provided care to my children. So infant care, 1 year of infant care is $14,000. That's a huge chunk of change. And people wonder why the birth rate is falling in this country.
so I think part of the problem is we have over-regulated that industry in Kansas, especially. I mean, the gal down the street can no longer watch her kids legally anymore. And so that's one way we could address it, is to allow smaller type operations to happen, to watch 3 or 4 kids at a time. We don't allow that right now in Kansas.
Representative Tarwater, this is Lana Duvall. Completely agree. We do a child care boot camp for communities all across the state of Kansas. The largest number of child care slots that we've lost in the state of Kansas was due to doing away with the registered child care provider and instead shifting entirely to the licensed child care provider. When we did that, we lost so many home child care providers, and we could not pick that up at centers.
And then another thing that you mentioned was the out migration. The last study that I've seen, as far as our graduates, 62% of our college graduates leave the state. And we brought that up, with this engineering. The previous speaker spoke about the $10 million a year that we do for engineering students. I tried to tie that money last year in appropriations to out migration, so that we need to work with our universities to place our students, our graduates, in jobs in Kansas. We need to incentivize them somehow for that and track that. We are tracking it now. But I have 3 kids in college now, and when we tour, all the state colleges, the first thing they tell you is that how they can place you all over the country, without really mentioning a whole lot about keeping you in Kansas and finding good jobs in Kansas. So the mindset of our universities needs to change. Now there's an exception. Wichita State does a really good job because of their innovation campus, where students actually work for companies as they learn on campus. And most of those students stay in town. And Wichita State also does a good job of training for local companies. And so their graduation rate retention in Kansas is much higher than the other universities.
Well, we did a study for KU. We looked at some numbers, and we looked at the past 5 years. Kansas has actually retained, KU has retained 1,100 undergraduates, out-of-state undergraduates, kept them in the state. So we do actually attract people from out of state and keep some of them, not all of them, but we do manage to keep some of them.
Donna, on that stat though, did you get the counter stat of how many KU exported? So we know if it's a net gain or a net negative?
It's kind of hard to count export because so many of our graduates at KU work in the Kansas City metro, right? So they may live, in Missouri, but they're basically in the KC metro area. Right?
Sure.
So, I mean, we're not, I think we're keeping, if we looked at our region, we're keeping a lot. If we included the KC metro, we're retaining a lot of our students.
Okay.
We passed the Promise Act last year for Kansas students where we'll pay for their tuition for a 2-year college as long as they fill out all the FAFSA paperwork. And, they usually, most of these students qualify for FAFSA grants, and we don't really have, the state doesn't have to pay much. But I think we had at Johnson County alone, we had 300 students last year, first year of the program. And in order for them to qualify, they have to agree to live in Kansas and work for a Kansas company upon graduation, or they have to pay us back as a student loan. And that looks like it's going to be pretty successful keeping our students here.
Is there a period of time that they need to do that, Representative Tarwater?
2 years. I mean,
2 years. Got it.
Any Kansas graduate can fill out the paperwork. And I think we're going to open it up this year. There's a trailer bill coming. I think we're going to open it up for out-of-state students to come in, and we'll actually fund a 2-year tuition, thinking that after they work and live in Kansas for 2 additional years, that they'll establish roots and stay here.
I have a student who studied Promise programs throughout the country, and they're very effective at people getting a credential and staying in the area. So I think that's money well spent.
Any other questions while we have Donna?
Hey, Donna, can I go back to your skills gap survey and, the fact that you kind of mentioned we've got community colleges, we've got tech colleges, we've obviously got the regents in 4 years, public, private, et cetera.
Mhm.
But is there some low hanging fruit out there from the skills gap that we know a 2-year community college or a 2-year technical college, if that was offered throughout Kansas, or at least all four corners of Kansas where there's a community or a tech school, that would move the needle, or is that why we need that skills gap survey?
Well, so, the labor market is very dynamic. So what we really want to know is what employers want, right? Now you could kind of do data mining and look at like Burning Glass and scrape ads to kind of come up with what skills are out there. Or you could go talk to employers and figure out what they're looking for. And then you can match that up with the credentials that we're producing in the state. I think that is, a baseline that is important to have as you think about the investments that you're going to make.
Anyone else, or should we move on? Well, thank you, Donna. Really appreciate. Whoa, Donna dropped real fast. Ashley, could we go back to slide 15 in order to kind of push the conversation forward? Let me back up a little bit. Um, 15? Maybe my deck numbering is off. Nope. Keep going back a little bit. Here, stay here. I guess I'd ask people kind of coming out of this, you've seen the submissions in these 3 areas, kind of workforce development, workforce resources, and innovation entrepreneurship. We've had some discussion around them. And, one of the points that I had made earlier, Representative Tarwater, was that, in total, across all the submissions that came in, there are about $13 billion in submissions against $721 million of funds. And if you just even 8 billion of those came in the economic revitalization bucket. And then if you just look at the number of submissions, so not the dollar volumes, it was well over half of all of the submissions. So really broad canvas to cover. Lots of things coming in. We're a little bit kind of like the all else bucket in some ways. And so it's going to be really important to kind of pick the focus areas to really drive in on. And I think Matt was talking about that the last time. Let's pick 4 or 5 areas that we can really dive in on and begin to kind of craft out, where we think, the solutions, the most important ones to focus on and what the nature of those solutions might be in the time that we have. So I guess one question is, now that we've had these discussions and you've looked at the submissions, in terms of workforce and innovation and entrepreneurship, do people generally feel like those are kind of 2 long poles in the tent to really be focusing on?
I would say that would be a priority of mine anyway. On the workforce development and retraining, I think Lana shed some light on that last week, and I forget what it is you said, but it was retraining is just basically taking an employee from one company to another and leaving the first company high and dry. But I know I'm misquoting her. So if you're there, would you kind of clarify what you said last week? Because that caught my attention.
Sure. Yeah. So you pretty well summed it up. It's just anytime we're moving people, from one position to another, we're just leaving a hole where we pick them from. When we have unemployment rates as low as they are, and we don't see a lot of people. Like I said, my county, 40,000 people, we have 26 people out of 40,000 who are on unemployment benefits. So we don't have an unemployment problem. We have a people problem. We do not have enough people to fill the growing economy that we're building across the state.
Okay, thanks for clearing that up.
So I guess
Tim, you kind of look like you disagree with that.
No, I don't disagree with what she was saying at all. What I think is that there are different priorities for different parts of the state. There's definitely, I'm hearing and I'm learning that there are issues with housing, with workforce, just sheer numbers more in rural areas. Well, they're an issue here as well too. But what she is saying is I don't agree with her on robbing Peter to pay Paul. I think we need workforce training and reinvesting in workforce training is needed. But I think there are different priorities in different parts of the state in areas in my mind. And so these things, John, that we're showing right now, I think they fit the urban areas for sure. I think there are different needs potentially, these plus maybe some that Lana has around workforce about housing and some other things. And I don't want to put words in her mouth, but it just seems like there's a few more in the rural areas than in the just my opinion.
Yeah. I guess, and once again, I'm not the one who should be doing the prioritizing, or I need to be kind of content neutral in this. But it sounded to me, in looking at the submissions, that in innovation and entrepreneurship, there seem to be kind of 2 areas. One is kind of tied to the universities and those ecosystems, and another one is just kind of generally tied to what's required in order to kind of support entrepreneurship, particularly ones that could be major job drivers eventually, outside of that kind of higher ed context. And then in the workforce area, I agree with you. There are lots of things around rural, but it seemed like there were things around just the number of people, how do we attract folks and how do we staunch some out-migration? And then there's also something that Brian was talking around making sure that we're up and down the educational process, driving, and that's even beyond, high school and maybe more targeted. Are we driving against the right skill sets to drive the kind of industries of the future. That's kind of what I was taking from it, but I mean, I'll just open it up. Once again, I'm not the one who's supposed to be
Yeah.
coming.
John, I'll jump in. I'll jump in there and say that I think there's obviously for our state elected leadership on this call and others that listen in and watch this, obviously there's policy decisions, regulations, things that I think can affect some, at the edges of these conversations. I'm like everybody on the committee. All of these things are important. I think all of these are a priority. It's just a matter of there's a finite amount of resources and $13 billion of asks. And so how we kind of drive, and I keep coming back to it, I've said it on previous calls, but how do we be catalytic? How do we do, I would rather do a few things really well than lots of things sprinkled to kind of, get us a little bit further down the road. And that in and of itself, not a bad use of resources. So if that's how ultimately the Spark Executive Committee and state leadership decide to take this, then great. Because again, all of these things are needed. I would lean less, again, workforce development and workforce resources is absolutely important in my part of the state. And when I was working in Johnson County, I would lean probably more towards innovation and entrepreneurship and this topic today, simply because I think it can be more catalytic. Now, I still want to get into the finer points of the actual submissions themselves and which ones I think can make more impact. But again, all of it's important, but if we have limited time and limited resources to discuss these things, I would lean towards the first, the innovation and entrepreneurship, just my opinion.
I would tend to agree with you, sir. And also, if there are, policy suggestions, we certainly should make those because we can push those from our end. Especially I'm the Commerce Chair, so we can introduce the proper bills going into next year. This year is pretty much spoken for, but next year we could write some pretty good legislation over the summer and introduce it around workforce development, innovation, entrepreneurship. I mean, we've got a lot of money that we're supposed to be spending on entrepreneurship with the lottery funds, and we just blow those on other odds and ends. We need to address that right away.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
With these areas, though, generally, and we can kind of craft how to think about where to focus in them to the extent that we know we'll continue to refine that. Are these areas that, and once again, we're only hitting half of the, this is a 3A versus a session 3B. Are these, though, both areas that you'd want to at least kind of create some programmatic definitions around so that they can then move forward to the scoring exercise? It may be that innovation or entrepreneurship, what we come up with there scores higher, but are they still both kind of worthwhile to kind of keep going to the next step? Yep. I'm seeing some nodding. Okay.
Yeah, I think so. I mean, I think the key on these is when you get, for instance, on what's catalytic or what's not, my instinct is that the most potential may be not in supporting particular entrepreneurs or entrepreneurial enterprises, but to create this infrastructure or network to, attract and many entrepreneurs and have a sustained environment in Kansas where more job creators, more entrepreneurs want to come here to try to start their businesses. I can also see, potentially some catalytic activity in the workforce development, but, depending on where that's targeted. Brian mentioned we need more computer scientists. We need them in Kansas. We need them in country. We need them in the world. I don't know that we have a submission in that direction or if that's realistic for us, but they're probably, if there are particular skill sets and workforce needs that look like they could be a multiplier and they fit well with in Kansas, then those could be valuable things to explore as well. But I think all these topics have potential.
One other thing I'd say of one particular thing I believe Representative Tarwater made the comment is that on the higher ed, the university kind of innovation parks, that actually can serve both the purpose around innovation and entrepreneurship kind of at a systemic level, but it also actually helps retain people who've just been educated in the universities in Kansas. So it has a little bit of both. And usually just because of the nature of the universities, they tend to be covering the subjects that are of interest to companies in the state. So you're not necessarily picking a winner there. The system itself allows you to do it. But once again, I don't want to push things too.
I'd also point out that the innovation type campus, like the Wichita State and like KU is looking at, when you speak to employers, their return on investment is much quicker. The productivity of that employee once hired, Cerner, for example, told me if they hire somebody off of an innovation campus type position or education, that within 6 months they're up and running. And out of a normal university, it's almost 2 years before they're productive in their workforce. So that's another thing to think about.
Let's go to if you can go to the slide where we wanted to kind of look at the full range of focus areas.
John,
Okay, go ahead.
I was just going to make a real quick comment. I two words jumped out at me from what Brett was saying. I think that the multiplier effect, if you go back a slide just real quick, the multiplier effect I think is important, and infrastructure. So I think he said it so much better than what I was trying to say earlier in our conversation, but it's that idea of what things are needed from an infrastructure perspective for entrepreneurial pursuits for these incubator spaces, that sort of thing, that could be catalytic for not just one project, but for a range of projects and ideas. Yeah. And so it's that infrastructure piece that fits within this innovation and entrepreneurship category. I think that in my view has a lot of merit. I'm not saying that discrete projects don't either, but I think that there's it would be good to look at that area for what could be done to then really multiply efforts across multiple projects.
Yep, makes sense. So this slide, we basically had shown earlier that what we were covering around innovation and entrepreneurship, workforce resources. We didn't go into workforce retention because that had been a little deprioritized in terms of what we were hearing in the previous session. But that leaves us in terms of the potential focus for the next session, similar in bringing in some of these areas experts around things that were categorized in other industry support, tourism sector, cybersecurity, then down into the housing topic, which we definitely want to do a deep dive on, water and sewer infrastructure. We got an awful lot of submissions there, probably partially because it's explicitly called out as a allowable use of funds. Of course, there's other work going on at the state level around that, and then a number of things around infrastructure renovations, public space, and resource enhancement, food systems, other financial assistance. I guess a little bit to read, just kind of in the interest of prioritization that I'd like to get from the panel here is, of the things that we didn't cover today and are remaining, are there areas that people say super important for us to really make sure we deep dive on? And we were pretty sure that housing, for instance, was going to be one. But are there any other areas where people just have a feeling, in the interest where, yeah, really important or not as much of a focus?
Well, and I'll go, John. I don't know if it's kind of fits within kind of the titles of these focus areas or the categories per se. And I know you guys are trying to kind of coalesce and streamline hundreds of applications into something that makes sense. But to me, I go back, whether it's infrastructure, like physical, civil infrastructure, municipal, local government infrastructure, or kind of infrastructure of projects. I think that's something that, again, where my mind goes to kind of catalytic. How do we make a one-time investment now that could help bring our state long-term in a multiplier kind of reward? So that, to me, that's where I want to hear. I absolutely agree with the deeper dive and getting a better handle around housing, what those catalytic housing investments might look like. So that's important to me. But the one that it doesn't fit in here, but I really want to hear more about is, and it's around I know we have the background on the state's framework for growth plan, but industry focus. Our economy is built on the core industries of our state. And I don't want to reinvent the whole structure and the paradigm of how we're looking at these submissions, but at the same time, how do we use our industries? And quite honestly, what proposals, what programs, what suggestions do we make that propel our industries forward, which are the wealth generators of our state? That's where my mind keeps going.
Yeah, that's a great point, Andrew. And I was even talking with the team about how we handle session 3B. And there's a lot in that other industry support that are around some of the industries that were called out in the framework for growth, like aviation, advanced manufacturing, ag, cybersecurity. There are a number of things there, and we need to kind of have a view for which submissions fall into which one of those industries as we kind of and have a discussion around those. I saw you nodding as well, Representative Tarwater, but someone else just talked. Sorry.
This is Tim, John. I was wondering, can we have somebody from the Commerce Department or whoever the subject matter expert would be to give this panel a high overview on our 3B meeting of, hey, these are the targeted sectors that the state is prioritizing and trying to create incentives and infrastructure for, so that we can be a destination for major employment?
We can do anything that the panel wants us to do. So if the panel wants us to do that, we can bring them in. Anyone second that?
I think that could be good.
John,
I was just going to ask about the water and sewer infrastructure category. That's right at a quarter, right, of the 400 submissions, 107. Yep. I'm curious to hear from other panel members their take on this category. I think I expressed last time, not talking about any particular project, but I think overall just less enthusiasm for this category, given other sources of funding that are available for these types of projects, even though these are explicitly allowable, which I respect that. But I guess where I sit today, I'm just not as enthusiastic about, thinking about a quarter of our time focused on water and sewer infrastructure projects. And I'm curious to take the pulse of everybody else.
Representative Tarwa, can you start to tell us what the state's doing? Kind of like how you mentioned, like the state had that $100 million for affordable housing. Do you have some data you can share with us here that the state's working on?
I can. So after talking to you last time, I met with the chairman of the water committee, and I also gave him a copy of these 107 submissions that were clean water and access to drinking water and sewer and all that stuff. They are working on that pretty actively. He did pass a bill out yesterday. The bill changed dramatically before it was pushed out of committee. But they are focusing on that, and most of these are coming from local governments that are budgeted for this. Whether or not they spend their money on it is the question. And there seems to be all kinds of confusion on whose liability it is between all these different water districts and cities and counties. I don't know that much about it, but he is going through these submissions and he's making notes for me so that I can kind of get a better idea. But most of this stuff would have been addressed in his big bill that he had. And, like I said, that did get changed pretty dramatically. These local governments also did get, or a lot of them did anyway, lump sum of money from the federal government. And I believe that a lot of these submissions were submitted simply because we had it as a category and they're just trying to supplant their local budgets.
Some things got submitted across all the panels that fell into the what does it hurt category.
Right.
Submit, right. Yeah.
John?
I'd echo what the comments of other committee members. I mean, again, falls in the category of helpful and would be nice. And infrastructure is needed, particularly infrastructure, water and sewer that are advancing maybe a business park or could lead to job creation is helpful. But at the same time, I do think there are state resources. I also think the IIJA, the federal stimulus and federal transportation bill will get at some of this. So there's going to be some additional federal dollars as well. So I would agree with Sam to maybe lower this on the priority list. Not that it's unimportant, but at the same time, we have to limit.
Well, let me ask what I'm hearing, and just anyone correct me if I'm wrong, is that of the things we haven't covered, it seems like the things that are in kind of the business focus area around really kind of tying that to like thinking about industries of future framework for growth, as well as around housing, and seeing what they may be able to do to kind of help crack that nut, maybe kind of two of the biggest remaining areas to really focus in on. If I misspoke there, just tell me.
Hey, John, before we switch subjects on that, I think Tim's been waiting patiently to say something.
Oh, I'm sorry. Go ahead, Tim.
Well, thank you. I was just going to say that I'm kind of there with you guys on water sewer. Although, once again, is it may be a different issue in a rural area versus it's probably, and I agree with Representative Tarwater that we here in Olathe or in urban areas, we should handle our water and sewer. We're large enough to be able to handle it. If out in Western Kansas, if water and sewer are tied to bringing new housing and it can help with that housing issue, I don't have a problem with water and sewer if it's tied to new housing or jobs. And so, once again, it may not be apples to apples, and I'm open, but I agree with you. If there's a water or sewer issue in an urban area, unless it's directly tied to jobs, it's not a high priority for me.
Mm-hmm.
And John, on the housing issues, after last meeting, Lana sent me, she did quite a bit of research and quite a bit of work on what she was talking about last time. And she sent that to me in an email. With her permission, I'll forward that to you so you can circulate it to the committee. If we're going to be talking about that next time, it might be wise to review that. Mm-hmm. And she even went as far as to put a kind of a scoring card in place to review anyway.
Great. So just not to say that we're necessarily totally eliminating anything at this point, although we're going to need to kind of focus in, but eventually. But once again, is it fair to say that kind of those other areas in business beyond innovation entrepreneurship, particularly if they're driving towards kind of something fundamental, in things like the framework for growth, like industries that are kind of targeted to grow in the future, and housing, those are the things though that people might feel the most energy around. And some of the other ones, it's kind of a little bit situational, kind of it depends.
In terms of, John, is your question in terms of next meeting's focus?
Yeah. Mm-hmm. How much of it to give to the different pieces? Uh-huh.
I think so. And it would be interesting to know if there's a nexus between any of the housing proposals or water proposals and the framework for growth. Like, do we have an indication that aerospace or one of these focus industries is saying, I need this to make things go? Is there overlap? Mm-hmm. But I generally agree with what you're saying.
Okay.
I, for one, I'm struggling a lot with the housing proposals on how we're going to do that fairly. I just don't know that it's the government's place to be buying houses for people or giving them a large sum of money for a down payment.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
On something that they otherwise wouldn't be able to afford. And when the marketplace is, it's very expensive right now, more expensive than ever to build a house. And if we try to rush through this, we're going to inflate those costs even more.
Yep.
by building houses and taking up the materials. I'd rather see on, it would be my opinion anyway, on the housing stuff to try to figure out a better way to purchase, help large purchases of materials to drive down the cost for, kind of buying in bulk type situation, or even give it a year until the costs come down, because they will come down. They have come down, then they went back up.
Yeah. What can you do systemically? Right.
Right.
Is there a leverage?
Yeah. Representative Taro, I hope Lana is okay with you sharing that with our panel, the document she showed you. For me on the housing piece, I will say I struggle with it because I don't know enough, but I take things back to my world from the automotive side. We own 7 car dealerships, right? I have customers that come into our dealerships all day, every day, say that, hey, I want that $40,000 car, but their income, their down payment, their credit, et cetera, can really get them into a $20,000 or $25,000 car. We try to adjust their will and ability, their want and needs to make that fit. So I look at housing kind of the same way and do that same, prism of like, what are we looking at? And so it's hard for me to understand how government or us should go in to subsidize that. I think there's potential innovations on how we build homes, whether it be a combination of 3D printing or like Representative Tarwater said, can we put together almost a conglomerate that could buy the materials into a greater, so that we have higher buying power, but also let the market adjust. But I would love to see those things. I mean, I obviously see that's important for affordable living, is important for retention and recruitment of workforce, which we know we need, but just trying to connect that dots, and I'm struggling bridging that gap right now. And I'm glad Lana, she just put in the chat that Representative Tarwater could share that with us, but just need more information on that.
Yeah. All right. Well, great discussion. We've already kind of run over for this. In terms of next steps, what we're going to do, and we'll the exit survey, we're going to, in the areas we covered today, begin kind of crafting as a straw man, a placeholder. We'll get the advisory panels of input, some thinking around those areas, and begin getting ready with kind of a focus of emphasis of really making sure on the housing side, we're going to continue to explore that, and we'll dive into it. It's a heavy duty driver, but the question there is it point solutions that are expensive, or is it something you could do systemically? And then up in the business area, really making sure we're kind of linking in an industry focus, and continue to get kind of more information around the water and sewer side to understand kind of what could be happening here versus elsewhere. And then to the point around, what is the overlap and kind of the locus points between the industry growth of those industries and the housing and water and other infrastructure issues. With that said, I don't want to leave people, in the session much farther beyond this, but any kind of closing thoughts from anyone on the panel or from the chairs? I think we had great discussion. It may not seem like we perfectly wrapped anything up at this point, but we're definitely kind of heading down that kind of right track of thinking about the high leverage areas to focus in on. Anything, anyone?
John, for me, I just want to reiterate, would love to have somebody from Commerce or someone else
Right.
Be one of our keynotes. And
right.
quite frankly, I wouldn't mind another innovation and entrepreneurship speaker as well, because I think when it comes to major investments that can change things from a large scale, I don't think we can hear from enough people from that category.
Yeah. Well, and Matt actually has a bit of a focus here. He wasn't able to make the session, but we reached out to him. And so having him on the next session would probably be helpful as well. But anyone else can think of in those spaces or others, let us know.
I have something for clarification on Brian's presentation. He mentioned the angel investor tax credit and that it can only be transferred by an out-of-state investor. We did revisit that bill last year, and we did make some changes. It was Senate Bill 66, and it doesn't specify, and I made sure I looked this up before I corrected him, but it doesn't specify in-state or out-of-state. It's just that it says any investor without a current tax liability at the time of investment can transfer it. And it can be transferred to anyone with a tax liability in Kansas. So it doesn't specify in state or out of state. We did make that change already. So we listen, see?
Awesome progress. Well, thanks. Well, appreciate it. Thank you. Great discussion. Like I said, I do think we had some great discussions, and I think we're beginning to hone in on some areas in a really, really broad subject area. So appreciate it. Thank you.